In the dry hills of Umuofia, where wind howled through cracked earth and the night came darker than most places, there lived a man named Ebube. He was tall, handsome, and wealthy by village standards. His compound was large, his barns always full, and his charms, both spoken and unspoken, ran deeper than anyone suspected. But there was something else about Ebube, something no one spoke of directly. He had buried 2 wives before the age of 30, both under strange circumstances, both in their sleep. The elders questioned him, softly at first, but he mourned just enough to silence them. The priests asked the gods for answers, but the oracle remained quiet. And so time moved on. Then came the sisters. They were daughters of a respected family in the neighboring village of Eziama, Ngozi, Adaeze, and Kioma. All beautiful, all graceful, and all drawn to Ebube in different ways. Ngozi, the eldest, was curious. Adaeze, the middle, was cautious. Kioma, the youngest, was fearless. One by one, he courted them. He brought palm wine to their father, offered gifts, made promises that glowed in the sun. At first, the idea of marrying one man to 3 sisters seemed like madness, but Ebube was persuasive, and their family was eager for the match. He would care for them, protect them, raise their names. And so, the marriages happened quickly. 3 ceremonies in 1 week, 3 wives under one roof. And on the 7th night, the village slept quietly. But at sunrise, only Ebube emerged from the compound, alone. His eyes were dry, his hands were clean, and his voice, when he spoke to the elders, was calm. They were taken, he said, in their dreams. But the gods knew better, and so did the ground beneath the house. The village buzzed with silence the morning after. No screams had been heard, no signs of struggle, no blood, just 3 beds neatly laid, 3 bowls of untouched food, and no trace of Ngozi, Adaeze, or Kioma. Ebube told the elders he had gone to the stream before sunrise. When he returned, they were gone, taken perhaps by jealous spirits or envious gods. He suggested a ritual, a cleansing, an offering. The chief, uneasy but bound by tradition, agreed, but behind closed doors, whispers started. People remembered the other wives, how they too had vanished in the night, how no one had seen their bodies, only funerals, only shadows. It was said that Ebube's land grew greener after every loss, that his barns overflowed in years others starved. Still, no one accused him openly. No one dared. Until Mama Ifioma, the blind widow who lived near the shrine, spoke up. She had seen something, she said, not with her eyes, but with the ones the gods had left behind when they took her sight. That night, just before dawn, she heard 3 voices, not crying but chanting, soft, in rhythm, as if they knew their time was short. And then she heard laughter, low, male. She told the elders, their bodies may be gone, but their breath still clings to his walls. Ebube dismissed her as mad, called her cursed. But the people started watching him more closely. He walked lighter, smiled thinner. And at night the crows began circling his compound, though no one could say why. 3 wives, 1 night, and not even a scream to show for it. But spirits rarely scream when they know where they're going. Only the living wonder where the silence begins. The days that followed felt longer than usual in Umuofia. The sun hung lower, the shadows stretched wider, and the air turned dense with things unsaid. Ebube carried on with practiced grace, feeding his goats, tending to his yams, greeting neighbors with a nod too perfect to trust. But at night, strange things began to happen. The villagers heard humming, 3 distinct voices, soft, feminine, and always in harmony. The kind of tune a mother might sing to soothe a restless child. It drifted from Ebube's compound around midnight, floating over fences and settling in ears like a warning. At first, people thought it was wind, until the wind started answering. Mama Ifioma spoke again. "They are not resting," she said. "He did not send them to the gods. He sent them somewhere else, somewhere beneath." Some laughed, others avoided her path. But deep down, everyone remembered how the earth around Ebube's home had shifted slightly after the weddings. Subtle cracks in the ground, like breath being held just below the surface. Chioma's best friend, Amaka, decided to visit. She knocked once. No answer. Twice. Still silence. She stepped inside the compound, calling softly, "Ebube?" But he wasn't there. Instead, she found 3 clay dolls placed in a circle on the floor of the main hut. Each one bore a red thread tied around its neck. In the center was a bowl of blackened palm oil. Floating on the surface were 3 strands of hair, long, thick, and unmistakably different in texture. Before she could run, the door slammed shut, and in the dark, the dolls turned ever so slightly toward her. No sound, just a whisper. "We know how the night ended. Do you?" Amaka didn't scream. Something about the hush in the room made even fear hold its breath. She stood frozen, eyes locked on the 3 dolls. Their tiny heads tilted just enough to make her feel seen. Not watched, seen. As though they knew who she was, why she had come, and what price she might pay for stepping into a house where breath no longer meant life. Then the bowl in the center began to stir. The black palm oil rippled, though no wind touched it. The hairs on its surface spun slowly, weaving together into a single braid. From somewhere behind her, a floorboard creaked. Then another. She turned. Ebube stood in the doorway, shirt loose, barefoot, eyes darker than night. He said nothing. His face was calm, too calm, a calm that felt like a cliff's edge. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally. Amaka stepped back, her voice thin. "What happened to them?" He tilted his head. "They're with me." "You mean they're dead?" A smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Not dead, bound." He moved closer, his steps light, almost weightless. "Some love is too heavy for the living, so I gave it to the parts of them that don't die." Amaka's skin prickled. She looked again at the dolls. Their shadows on the floor had grown longer, stretching toward her feet. Ebube reached down and lifted one of the dolls. Chioma's, she could tell by the beaded thread around its waist. He cradled it with care, like it still breathed. "They sang to me," he said. "That night, all three. They didn't beg. They surrendered." He looked at Amaka now, eyes glinting. "Do you want to hear the song?" But outside the wind howled and the dolls began to hum. The humming grew louder, circling the room like smoke. It wasn't just sound, it was memory. A sound that made the walls tremble with things they couldn't contain. Amaka pressed herself against the farthest corner, her heartbeat thudding louder than her breath, but still not loud enough to drown out the tune. Ebube knelt, placing the doll back in its circle. His fingers moved with a lover's tenderness. The dolls now rocked gently, as if cradled by invisible hands. "They didn't suffer," he said, his voice low, almost wistful. "They became something better, something I could keep." Amaka's fear began to twist into something else. Not rage, not sadness, but grief. These were her friends, women with dreams, laughter, stories. Not clay and thread, not trophies in a circle. She swallowed the lump rising in her throat and stepped forward, just once. "What did you do to them?" she asked, voice shaking. Ebube looked up. "I gave them peace. No man to betray them. No child to bury them. No hunger. No dust." His eyes were gleaming now. "I loved them so much. I couldn't let the world touch them." The dolls stopped rocking. The floor beneath them cracked, just slightly. A hairline fracture running between the clay figures. The bowl of palm oil tipped on its own, spilling black across the earth where it moved like blood toward the fracture. Ebube noticed. His smile faded. He knelt quickly, trying to contain the spill, his fingers shaking now. "No, no, not yet." But the oil kept moving. The dolls began to hum again, off-key this time, louder, and their tiny clay mouths parted, just enough for breath, just enough for a voice. "Ebube," they whispered. "We never said yes." The moment the dolls spoke, something in the air cracked, a sharp, invisible snap that made Amaka stagger backward and clutch her chest. The oil on the floor stopped spreading. It pulsed, then coiled back in tendrils, slithering toward the dolls like it had been called home. The fracture beneath them deepened with a sound like splitting bone. Ebube froze, his eyes wide, lips parting as if he was about to protest, to explain, to beg. But no words came. The dolls rose, not quickly, not violently. They lifted from the ground like smoke rising from fire, their shadows stretching higher than their bodies, dancing on the walls. Their heads turned, each one locking eyes with Ebube. He whispered, "You promised." Ngozi's doll replied first. Her voice was hollow, but steady. "We promised each other." Adaeze followed, sharper. "Not you. Not this." And Kioma's voice last, soft but final. "You didn't marry us. You buried us." The walls of the compound groaned as the ground beneath the dolls opened, just slightly, but enough to breathe. A breath that came from below, deep, cold, ancient. Ebube fell to his knees, hands trembling, mouth quivering. "I loved you," he whispered. But the dolls floated higher. They no longer needed his belief. They were becoming something he couldn't name. Spirit, vengeance, memory. Maybe all three. Amaka watched in horror and awe. Then, without warning, the dolls collapsed. Not shattered, just dropped, lifeless, as if something had left them. And Ebube screamed, not out of pain, but because he knew what had left wasn't gone. It had simply moved, and it wasn't done with him yet. Ebube stumbled backward, eyes wild, breath short. The dolls lay still now, but the air around them pulsed with something thick and electric. The fracture in the floor continued to widen, revealing a darkness beneath the hut. Not the kind born of shadow, but of something buried. Something waiting. Amaka didn't move. She couldn't. It was as if the room itself held her still, demanding she witness what came next. Ebube turned to her. Desperation twisted across his face. "You don't understand," he rasped. "They would have left. They always leave. I just made sure they stayed." His voice cracked on that last word, as if even he no longer believed it. Then came the footsteps. 3 sets, soft, bare, approaching from nowhere. Ngozi, Adaeze, Kioma. Not their bodies, but their presence, their weight in the room, the smell of earth after rain, the chill of a breath on the back of the neck. Amaka saw nothing, but she felt them, and so did he. Ebube's hands flew to his ears. "Stop!" he hissed. "I gave you everything." But the voices kept coming. This time, not from the dolls, from beneath, from the crack in the earth. "You took what wasn't yours. You wore love like a knife. You buried us in silence, but we learned how to speak." The wind inside the hut twisted, circling fast now, lifting dust and memory in a spiral that made the walls groan. The fire at the altar went out, and in that silence, Amaka saw it. A hand, pale and cracked like dry clay, reaching up from the fracture, reaching not for her but for him. Ebube tried to run, but the hand gripped his ankle with a force that made the air snap. His scream was raw, half man, half animal, as he fell face first onto the earthen floor. He clawed at the ground, kicking, digging into the cracks, but it was no use. The hand held firm. Another rose to meet it. Then a third. Ngozi, Adaeze, Kioma. They didn't speak anymore. They didn't need to. Their silence now was heavier than words, denser than grief, deeper than any grave. Ebube twisted onto his back, eyes wild, mouth frothing with panic. "I gave you a home," he shouted. "I gave you love." The ground answered with a sound like splitting wood and thunder wrapped in soil. No one gave them back. The fracture beneath him widened. Dust poured in from the walls. One of the dolls cracked, Ngozi's, splitting clean down the middle. Then the others followed. As each one broke, Ebube's body shuddered, as though something inside him had been tethered to them all along. Amaka couldn't look away. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was witnessing balance, the kind that only the earth could serve. Ebube screamed one last time, a sound swallowed halfway by the ground as he was pulled downward, not fast, not sudden, but slow, like the earth wanted him to feel every inch of descent, like it was welcoming him home. When it was done, the crack sealed shut, just like that. No blood, no trace, only silence. Amaka stepped out of the compound at dawn. The sky was pale, and the air smelled cleaner than it had in years. Behind her, the hut stood still. The dolls were gone, and on the threshold, burned faintly into the clay, was a single word: remember, because the earth always does. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, please give the video a like, share what you learned in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more enchanting tales like this one. Thank you for being part of the journey.